Hello and welcome to the iTnews podcast, brought to you by Stellar Cyber and the 2024 State of Security Report. I'm Ray Crozier, Editor-in-Chief of iTnews. At the end of this episode, Steve Salinas, the Head of Product Marketing at Stellar Cyber, talks about how OpenXDR can provide an efficient solution to managing cybersecurity threats and mitigating skills shortages and burnout. But first, we head to our Sydney studio, where iTnews Associate Editor Eleanor Dickinson talks to NBN Co's Chief Security Officer Darren Kane about security strategy, risk quantification, and much more.
I manage both physical and the cyber component of security risk at the National Broadband Network. That includes all aspects of physical security, so the facilities and the infrastructure. It also includes all personnel security. Then I have responsibility for security risk and assurance. And of course, then there's cyber security defence and practice is an accountability that I own as well. And that's from one side of the entity to the other. So all aspects of security risk within the organisation, I have accountability for. I think the trend is towards a single owner of accountability for security risk in an enterprise. Why? Because it's very difficult to manage the risk transparently if you do not have accountability for physical security or personnel security and just cyber. So, from my perspective, the trend towards a Chief Security Officer instead of a Chief Information Security Officer is because technology platforms and applications are so closely integrated now, and there's so much available data that sits both with the egress points or access points from a swipe code, from HR systems, from a personnel security perspective, and of course from a cyber perspective. Now, if you have accountability for all three of those components, you have ownership of all that data. That gives you a more complete picture of security risk and how best to control it. If you don't have ownership of all that data, you have to seek ownership or you don't get a complete picture. Now, that doesn't matter so much until you're fighting for budget and resourcing. And it doesn't matter so much until there's a PIR when you're trying to identify what went wrong and why you've had a breach. If you have one accountable owner, it's that person's responsibility. If you have multiple accountable owners, you have to work through a process of why it didn't work.
Must be quite a weight, though, on your shoulders.
It is. The risk is always prominent and it's always there. But I also think with risk comes the opportunity through authority and control to try and do it properly. I don't always get it right, but I'd much rather have the authority and control to manage the risk to a level that is expected of me by the company, the board and the owners of the organisation, which is the Australian community, than I have to rely on other people to do something for me, and then it's their prospects of failure that'll also impact on me.
I want to touch on some of the threats that are transgressing between operational and cybersecurity and how you are able to balance being across all those different areas.
I've often said people, for example, are probably 85 to 90% of my largest threat in the organisation. By people, it doesn't necessarily refer to our customers, it doesn't refer to our employees, it doesn't refer to people within the group. People are a potential failure. The really good news is that people are also 100% of our solution. So when you talk about, well, how do you manage the threat of people? I ensure I do appropriate background checks. I'm sure I've got all the correct controls and compensatory controls in place to manage how we connect people. I then work to ensure that people have all of the education and awareness and opportunity to know what their responsibility is. So I work through that process so that when the company asks me, are you managing the controls around people within our risk appetite? I can select that and say, well, yes, these are the things I have in place, and this is how I manage the people risk. Another aspect of risk is obviously technology, which is similar. You actually look at what are your most critical assets, how do you prioritise and ensure that they've got the effective controls so that you're managing the risk against those assets to within the appetite of the company and what they expect.
Can you tell me at a high level what is NBN Co's security strategy and what are some of its key pillars?
Look, at a very high level, and you could probably understand why I can't be too intimate about what it is we do. Firstly, we do have a 5-year security strategy. We've just commenced a new one. I'm a huge believer in the fact that the strategy must be a living document. There's a capability for it to be nimble and flexible and meet different opportunities, threats and risks that we may not have perceived when we're formulating the strategy. The mission at the NBN is to lift the digital capability of all Australians. So our 5-year security strategy is obviously aligned quite closely to that mission. We run a converged security model, and that's really important to the NBN. We have an all hazards approach to all incident response and standing up to manage emergencies. The shared responsibility aspect within the strategy is very important. So what I don't wish is for anybody within the NBN to feel as though it is somebody else's problem to manage security. In the strategy, security is everyone's responsibility. We talk a little bit about the operating model and how our organisation within the security group manages 3 lines of risk defence, both operational, assurance and ultimately internal audit. The security governance structure is set out, and what we do around our policies, our standards and our guidelines is all detailed in the strategy. We have control frameworks that we align to loosely. We are guided by the Protective Security Policy Framework of the federal governments, simply because we're a GBE. We also use the cybersecurity framework under the NIST standards, and obviously very, very aligned and understanding of the actual requirements of the government around Essential 8. One of the key issues for us is compliance with changing legislation and reforms, and it wouldn't be appropriate for us not to mention the security of critical infrastructure reforms and the new government's cybersecurity strategy of 2023 to 2030. We're very aware and trying to be fully compliant and guided by that. Third-party risk is an area that is clearly called out in the strategy and what we have in place to manage those risks and the assurance requirements of that. And then ultimately, my favourite is people. For me, people are 60% of the issue. They're about 80% of the requirements to deal with, and then 100% of the solutions, and we call that out. And underlying all of that is this mantra around security as an enabler. If you treat security as an opportunity and not necessarily concentrate on the catastrophisation of the risk of security, you can almost take competitive advantage out of it. And I use this analogy when I'm talking about security as an enabler. If you can think of my face on the brake pedal of a performance motor vehicle, and if you can think of our CEO driving that performance motor vehicle, most people would expect that the CEO would tap the brake to stop the car, and that's the reason security exists within the organisation, which makes sense. Whereas I challenge that and say, no, security is an enabler that allows that CEO to drive that motor vehicle just as fast as they possibly can within the confines of their own ability, in the knowledge and confidence that if they need to stop because they go outside the confines of that ability, Darren's on the brake pedal and he can do that for him.
That's a great mental image of your face on my brake pedal right now.
But what it does is it helps you understand the importance of selling security as a positive rather than constantly talking it down. So that's an underlying theme within the strategy.
Can you tell me a little bit about how security is resourced at NBN Co?
Well, firstly, I am incredibly well supported through board and particularly C-suite to meet the expect of good security risk management right across the enterprise. So like any traditional business unit in any organisation, I have a CapEx and an OpEx, and I'm expected to be very commercial when I make prioritised decisions on how I spend that money. And what I do is I take a risk-based approach to the expenditure. What is the most critical of our issues? What issues may sit outside the risk appetite of the organisation? How much money have I got and how much money I can spend on the actual controls that I'll put in place to manage that risk and then reduce that risk to within the appetite of the organisation. And then there's so many other different competing interests other than just the risk within the organisation. Issues such as security of critical infrastructure reforms, compliance with government's legislation and regulations around the role we play as critical infrastructure. They might be extraordinary expenses that haven't been allocated at the start of the year. And that's when I would go back to our C-suite and to speak with the CFO and the financing departments and explain that there will be money required because this was not foreseen in the plan, but it has now popped up and we have to be compliant. So managing security risk from NBN has become quite an executive role more so than an operational on the tools role for a security expert. I have a largish team of people. I have a largish team of outside contractors that provide services. I have a number of different vendors that provide kit, and all of those have to be physically managed as well.
Do you find those budget conversations with internal and external stakeholders to be easier now than perhaps in the past, given your history in the security world?
Certainly, I've become more comfortable with understanding exactly what's required and understanding the commercialities of running a business for profit. The one thing that I try not to do is to catastrophise the downside risk of security risk. My mantra is definitely security as an enabler. And my recommendation to our management team at NBN is that it is a requirement to manage security risk within their appetite. If we do that, we should have comfort in the fact that we're compliant with regulation and reform. We're managing the organisation within the expectations of the statement of expectation provided by government. But most importantly, we've got the time and the opportunity to concentrate on other aspects of what it is that the NBN does, because we're comfortable and confident in what we've got in place around security risk for NBN. I think that's really important. My job isn't to continually stop the organisation because of security risk. It's to allow the CEO to push the organisation to within an nth of its performance capabilities, because they know that they've got someone in charge of security risk that will help them stop if they're required to do so.
Could you tell me how cyber education and good digital hygiene plays into your overall strategy?
Look, I love that question. It's probably my favourite part of the role I have. Without a doubt, influence and awareness, education, is truly the only proactive lever that doesn't cost an enormous amount of money, but at the same time can be incredibly effective. The external thought leadership to spend time with people like yourself on podcasts such as this, to provide education awareness leaderships of forums, keynotes, panels, fireside chats. On average, I'm doing that around about once a week in any given year. And I also enjoy educating probably the most vulnerable on issues such as good cybersecurity hygiene and scams awareness. Digital-based crime is an issue in our community at the moment, and there's a real thirst and appetite for people to know more about that and what controls they put in place. I think we in this security industry have done a wonderful job educating people on the risk, the downside of the issues if they don't manage risk better. I think there's a massive opportunity in us helping them better understand what controls they can put in place to manage the risk and have more confidence in putting those controls in place. And I think we also need to spend more time in primary, in secondary, and even in tertiary institutions, because those generations currently going through those schools and institutions have been born digital natives, and they don't have that inherent risk factor that we've all grown up with. So I think there's an opportunity to get in there and educate and make them more aware of the risk, and particularly help them understand that their security online or utilising technology is their responsibility.
We're seeing a generation that is used to, from a very early age, handing over their data in exchange for a service, essentially.
Basically, and sometimes when they hand that data over and they obtain the service, they do so at no cost. So perhaps they don't evaluate the value of the data they're handing over. I think there's, as I said, a great opportunity for us in the industry to spend more time with helping them better understand how important and valuable the data is they hand over, and how dangerous it may be should they not have the effective controls around it.
How are you finding that education piece filtering from the C-suite down to the entire organisation as a whole?
Look, I'm very lucky. I'm in my 20th year this year. I've just ticked over 20 years of being in senior security roles, both with our biggest telco, Telstra, and now almost 10 years with the NBN. And on both occasions, firstly, the boards and the C-suite are very engaged with what it is I do. And particularly in the last 6 to 7 years, the issue of cybersecurity and security risk in general has become quite prominent. So there's a lot of engagement and support, and their engagement is great. I think there's also an onus on me to ensure the way I communicate to them is simple and not complex. It helps them really understand what it is the risk is and what I'd require from them in the way of support to help manage the risk. I don't think the industry does that particularly well. I think we use acronyms and funky names that every time we use them, things like bad actor, attack surface. And the one I love at the moment, I've spent 20 years trying to convince people to trust me. And then I'm up at the C-suite trying to explain the concept of zero trust. I just think that we almost make it hard for ourselves by being too smart by half. I think we've got to start using everyday language, even the language of commerce, such as financials. And that's why I'm a big proponent of risk quantification in identifying security risk. I haven't perfected that yet, but I'm well on the way to that.
Because cybersecurity fatigue, I think, is becoming a real thing amongst all of us.
Look, I think you're right. I think acronyms and wacky names is something people do genuinely roll their eyes at. They're also worried about the constant catastrophisation of the downside of risk. In the old days, when we would come to them and explain, look, here's your problem, here's the risk, they would almost go, well, what do you need to spend? Well, this is it, and we'd take it away. The money would almost go into a black hole, and we'd be back with the wheelbarrow saying, right, we've sort of managed that risk, but here's another risk that's just evolved, and we've got the similar situation, and we do it again, and we do it again. And what's happened is, as generation of board and C-suite have started to better understand the controls and the requirements, and of course the risk, they're starting to ask some questions about how we're spending the money, and I think that's highly appropriate.
Moving on slightly, one of the big worries we've seen in the cybersecurity landscape has been supply chain threats, and obviously NBN Co being the backbone of broadband in Australia. I'd love to hear what your take is on how much you consider supply chain attacks a risk to NBN Co.
Like any entity that uses outsourced providers and vendors, third, fourth, fifth, sixth party, we are susceptible to supply chain risk. What you can do about that is to ensure that in your contractual arrangements, when you look to bring a new supplier on, or even an old supplier, you ensure that you've got effective security risk management and assurance capabilities, advising our procurement teams to ensure that the right level of requirements are written into the contract. You've also got an ongoing assurance capability to audit and ensure that those parties are meeting the requirements of the contract. You also build out a relationship and partnership with the vendor to ensure that when they feel that they may have an issue, that we are the first to be told, so that we can take effective action and see where we may be in danger. And then ultimately, I think there's also the opportunity to work in sync with the provider or supplier around education and awareness. So it's just that ongoing relationship in perpetuity, so that everybody recognises that security for NBN is not just the responsibility of NBN, but those are benefiting from a relationship, a commercial relationship with them. And any other entity that's managing supply chain would probably take those same steps.
I think the cybersecurity industry cannot function without partnerships between customers, partners, vendors. There are so many vendors out there doing cybersecurity. How do you kind of filter out the noise when you're choosing to bring on new capabilities or bring on a new technology from a vendor?
That's a really good question. I'm someone that is amazed at the startup culture in the cyber or security risk industry. I think it's fabulous. I think it's exciting. It brings on innovation and entrepreneurship. But it also becomes exhausting working your way through the next big thing and the next best thing, and whether you're keeping abreast of the changes and having the most effective controls in place. I always look to strength. Is it best to stay with some of the larger multinationals for the basic foundational requirements around security controls? And where we've got smaller niche gaps, look to a smaller provider to come in and offer their services. I think most importantly, it's almost hand in glove with your procurement team to ensure that whoever you engage meets all of the requirements of the procurement expectations as well. And as a government business enterprise at NBN, that procurement issue, are they on the panel? Do they have appropriate physical and monetary capability and support behind them? What's their track record like, and so forth, does hold quite a big sway in our evaluation of what we bring on.
Do you mind if I get your take on what you think is the next big thing into cybersecurity technology?
Personally, I think there's a massive opportunity in risk quantification. It's a firm belief that the C-suite now have a very, very good understanding of what the risks and the potential downside is. They want to understand, well, what's that going to look like in a dollar figure? And now with risk quantification, that can be provided. And then, of course, they'll ask us, well, Darren, if you were to take $2, $3, $4, $5 million and apply that to an effective control that would look at the downside of the risk and the cost of that risk potentially, what would happen? And I think by using the language of commerce, the financial language, the CEO, the CFO, the COO, Chief Customer Officer, all folks will understand exactly what I've just said and how I've explained it. I haven't had to say what the effective control is, how it works, use funky acronyms, use other specific security language that only those within the industry pretty much understands. It's all in dollars and cents.
You did mention you've come up to 20 years now in the security world, but before that, for 10 years, I understand you're in the AFP. That's quite the non-traditional career path.
Yeah, look, my background is with law enforcement. So I did nearly 19 and a bit years with the Commonwealth Government Law Enforcement, both with the Federal Police and with the Australian Securities Investments Commission. And about 2.5, 3 years with the National Crime Authority in between all that. So it's a non-traditional path, and it was mostly targeting transnational or organised crime. So that's largely my background. When I did go to Telstra in 2004, it was on the physical and personnel side of the business. And it was only by sheer luck that I was asked to take on a role as the Internet Trust and Safety Officer at Big Pond in about 2006 that I started to get into security risk online and the education and awareness through cyber safety. And through that grew my interest in cyber safety, then into cyber security, and that's what I've learned. But I will say that I do have a particular interest in cyber crime and what they call technology-enabled crime because of my background. And nowadays that sits very well because it looks as though one of our biggest detractors from a cyber security perspective is cyber crime gangs who are state-sponsored or operating from jurisdictions that is permissible within a state environment.
If there's anybody who's looking to get a role in the cybersecurity industry who may have not had a traditional career path through doing an IT degree or a cybersecurity degree, I'd love to hear what kind of advice you could give to them.
It's a great question for me, and I love the fact that I do get asked that quite often, and I can only say please do not focus on the very narrow success of getting into cybersecurity as a goal for your career. There is so many different pathways to get into the industry of security risk that will allow you to get your foot in the door, so to speak, become quite expert or understanding of that particular role at the very start. And let's call that security administration. So somebody who ensures that the appropriate person you're onboarding in the organisation gets the appropriate access pass to a facility. Now, all that data has to be filled in because that data is incredibly important at a later date through detection processes. So you've got an attention to detail and you understand the process of provision of information and physical passes to individuals in an organisation. As you become better at that and understand the process, the opportunity might come up to help detection processes. And then you find that internally you get an opportunity to attend a digital forensics and become someone who can interrogate systems and interrogate devices. Think laptops, think iPhones or mobile devices and so forth. Through that skill, you'll become quite proficient. And then, of course, incident response comes along and says, listen, we need some people who can understand what to look for and have good understanding and appreciation of detection capability. So all of a sudden, that individual that originally came into the organisation to do security admin as a basic role has learnt the skills of forensics analysis and is now working in incident response. Then if they become quite elite at that, but enjoy the people management side of things, they find themselves carving out quite a successful career for themselves as they climb the opportunity ladder in security risk. Now, at the end of the day, they may very well end up as a CISO with some great skills in the cyber security stream. But they never really set out to be that because they had a broad view of just getting into the industry. If a person at a very junior age or even a mature age that just wants to get into cyber, it's quite a tight regime of opportunity and sometimes really difficult to break through.
Just looking ahead, what's next for you then in terms of where you hope to be this time in 12 months?
Firstly, I truly enjoy and love working at NBN. And one of the stories I often tell, particularly to school-age kids that I get the opportunity to talk to, is that from the day that I walked into Telstra on the 4th of June, I think it was, in 2004, there hasn't been a day that I haven't learnt something new in the telecommunications and technology environment. And whilst I'm still learning and enjoying that environment, I'd be crazy to do too much else. The really good thing about the security risk industry is at the moment I can't see in the foreseeable future for myself and even someone as young as yourself a time when security risk will not be an important part of the management of any enterprise, household, engagement with technology. Appreciation, understanding and effective control of that risk will be as required as the mobile devices and the connectivity which is needed to make it all work. So therefore, you've got a job or a career in this space for as long as you want and for as far as you want. And the really good news is that the innovation and opportunity that comes with that is really exciting.
Cybersecurity teams have to manage threats that target networks and devices and minimise the impacts of any incursions. Steve Salinas, the head of product marketing at Stellar Cyber, says extended detection and response, or more specifically, Open XDR, enables cybersecurity teams to mitigate many threats and risks efficiently and effectively.
When you look at cybersecurity, I look at it as a problem that has two sides. You have an upstream side and downstream side. So let's take an example that we might be familiar with, a dam. Say a dam has a leak in it, and there's a village that's below the dam. So maybe the village is experiencing unusual activity in their reservoirs. They're getting full faster, and they're just not quite sure. So they get together and they decide, what we're going to do? We're going to make our reservoirs deeper. We're going to hire people to monitor it so we can make sure that these reservoirs don't get too full. So, that is certainly one way to address it. Probably a better way would be to go look at the dam and try to fix the dam. So the nice thing about an XDR technology, a good one, it's going to allow you to really address both the upstream by helping you better manage your data and the downstream by giving you good automation capabilities, response capabilities, integration capabilities, so you can really try to attack that problem both upstream and downstream.
SIEM and SOAR tools can help, but they can come at a high cost, as Steve explains.
Let's talk about SIEM for a second. For your SIEMs, even your next-gen SIEMs, a lot of them require some extremely talented security specialists to manage those technologies. If we go back to our dam analogy, the downstream side, where the SOAR is meant to help you automate the response capabilities, but to do that, you have to develop playbooks that, again, in a lot of products require coding capabilities that, frankly, just are not that available to most security teams. So unless you're extremely well-resourced and have that right skill set, the current SIEM products and SOAR products that are on the market are probably not going to be able to help you address the upstream and downstream problems in the security cycle.
Today's rapidly changing threat environment and a significant skills shortage place a lot of pressure on cybersecurity teams.
Security analysts are under a tremendous amount of pressure across the industry. And what we're seeing around most organizations, they're having a hard time keeping security analysts on staff. So we already know that there's a skills gap. But the worst part is you have security analysts that simply are deciding the job is just way too stressful because of the amount of alerts they're having to try to deal with every single day and the level that they have to maintain. As we all know, attackers only need to be right once, and the security analysts need to be right almost all the time. So you're seeing people leave the industry, and when you add that to the existing security skills gap, security teams are just getting thinner by the day.
These challenges of a rising threat landscape and skills shortage can mean many risks are being missed.
A lot of security teams, I think, for the most part, they're really focused on addressing alerts that have been identified as high priority or potentially high severity. So what's not getting looked at are your medium to low severity alerts and even some informational alerts that might be generated or events that might be generated by logs. Now, the problem is they're medium, low, and just informational. But if you were to correlate across all of those different alerts, you might actually identify, these individual alerts and log entries, they indicate a massive attack or some sort of attack that would, when you combine it, be a high priority. So the end of it is organizations actually have a much higher risk profile than they would probably be comfortable with this rising case backlog.
Choosing an XDR solution can seem daunting. Steve suggests 3 steps to finding the right XDR solution for your organization. Determine your needs, reach out to vendors, and test your shortlist in your environment.
So when you're looking at getting started with an XDR product, I always suggest don't call vendors right away. Look at your current situation, your staffing resources, your budget, and how your team is operating. Say, what is my problem? What am I trying to really solve? Maybe there are too many alerts. Maybe I don't have great threat intel. Maybe my team struggles with delivering consistent response capabilities. Really identify the couple of highest priority use cases that you really hope this XDR product can solve. Once you identify what's most important, then reach out to vendors and bring them in. Obviously, you're not going to take their word for it. You want to get it in your environment, put it through its paces, and really make sure before you bring any more technology into your security stack that it can actually meet your requirements. Because again, it's not a one-size-fits-all type of situation.
XDR solutions can be a cost-effective and efficient way to help manage threat detection and response. Unlike other tools, OpenXDR is less resource-intensive, an important consideration at a time when cybersecurity resources are scarce.
That's it for this fortnight's episode. Please let us know what you think by reviewing the IT News podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts from. Your feedback is appreciated and helps us create better content catered to you, our listeners. And for all the latest headlines and happenings in Australian technology news, and all the trends from our latest State of Security report, visit itnews.com.au.